So hi, my name is Jeff Knight, and I was the Pomona Chairman for the 1985 Cal Poly Rose Float, Only in America. During the 1985 float year, that was when the 1984 Summer Olympics were going on. And during that time period, that's when the close-of-nine pins that everybody collects today was really getting into gear, and Tournament wanted to jump into that. So that was the first year the Tournament actually authorized official Tournament of Roses pins for the floats. And we actually had a prototype that year first, which is actually in a darker blue than what became the final pin version, which was the lighter blue that most people know of today. And so they had 96 official pins that very first year for the 1985 float year. So Only in America was a float that really depicted all the different things that we did at that time as Americans. So it tried to have, mostly around the great outdoors, scenes from canoeing, nature, the mountains. We had a goat on the mountain with a hang glider. Hang gliding was big at the time. We also wanted to talk about where the future was going, and so we knew that America was founded on the Wild West, wagon trains, and we thought it'd be really cool to have kind of that concept of a wagon train jetting into space. And so that was the whole idea of this covered wagon flying essentially out through the front of the float into the folks and into the crowd. So the first thing they would see was they would see this low pod and this wagon kind of bouncing, just the motion of the float, which we actually used cotton and things for the contrail, so it actually looked like a wagon that was jetting into space. Our innovation for Only in America was pneumatics, and on the back side of the float we had a very intricately made pneumatic vulture that was done by one of our assistant design chairs, Gail Palmer, that I would consider Disney-esque. There's not a lot of pictures of it that are still around because it was off-float, but that innovation in and of itself proved that we could actually do something of that degree. So in 1985, we tried to do some innovations on the float itself. And in that time period, it was a time period where we did make the scale models of the float so we could figure out how some of this stuff would work out of mostly clay and styrofoam at that time. So one of the things that was unique about our float is we had a hang glider going around a mountain, full circle, 360 degrees, in motion, while the float itself was going down the street. So we had to figure out all of the different pressures and cantilevers that needed to be in place for that to happen. One of the other things that we did was we had a wagon essentially flying through the air that was hanging off an I-beam, and literally to test that is what we would do is there was the horse out in front. We took turns at the lab sitting on top of that horse and just trying to bounce up and down on that armature to make sure it was going to be strong enough for the weight of the flowers and everything that were going to be part of the decoration materials. So the 1985 committee, as I was putting it together, I decided, because at that point I knew there was a lot of history sitting in the office with a lot of memorabilia, especially that went back to the 70s. And remember, this was in the 80s, so it wasn't too far from that time period, but I knew that stuff was getting lost. So I actually put on the committee what was the first historian role within the Cal Poly program, so that that person could then start actually collecting this history. And this is what really started off the beginning of what is today our archival collection. Another just part of the trivia of that particular float was it was the second time in history, John Friend being the first, where he was assistant chair on Happiness is Finding a Friend, and then became chairman the next year. I was vice chair on A Night to Remember and became chairman the next year as well. So the 1980 float year was one of those transition years for Tournament. In 1983, up until then, they were just looking for the best of any given category. So as an example, to that point, we'd won a lot of animation awards because we might not have had the best decorated floats, but we had the most awesome animation, especially once we went computerized, where we would have up to 32 pieces of motion on the float. Starting 84, 85 time frame, they really wanted to make a turn in that direction because there was a lot of dry materials being used in the parade, and so they were more going for the floral concept. So what they started doing was the judging was more, are you a beautiful float first? And then once they had the most beautiful floats figured out, then they would say, okay, you had some motion, so you get animation, etc. And it was at that point that one of those turning stages where it took us as Cal Poly a couple years to actually turn that corner to then start getting the major awards again, because we needed to really pick up the floral piece of the float, which we weren't doing at that time period.